Good afternoon. On behalf of Jacksonpal Pharmaceuticals Limited, makers of injection maintain, Lycored Prex sachet, and progesterone sustained release tablets as Divagest SR 200 and 300. I am Dr. Vipin Tyagi, along with my teammates Dr. Deepika Chhabra and Mr. Amit Saxena. Welcome you all to the webinar organized by Faridabad Obs and Gynae Society. We thanks we thank the office bearers of Faridabad Obs and Gynae Society for organizing this webinar, President Dr. Kiran Chandna and Secretary Dr. Chanchal Gupta. We thank ICOG for the accreditation of one ICOG point to all attendees of the webinar. Welcome all the esteemed faculty and attendees from across India and abroad who have joined us today. Please keep posting your queries by text in the Q&A box, which will be answered at the end of the session. Please note this webinar is streaming on Facebook Live and the recording will remain on Jacksonpal's YouTube channel for reference and promotion. I will now request Dr. Kiran Chandna to kindly initiate the session.
Good afternoon, dear friends and colleagues. A warm welcome to all of you for this CME on update on RH-negative pregnancy and fetus as patient. Now I welcome Dr. Ritu Khanna ma'am from Varanasi and Dr. Nitin Choval sir from Mumbai, who have agreed for their talk and to share their knowledge about the subject. Both of them, they are expert in their fields and they are kind enough to consider our request for the CME. And I am sure that we are going to have good knowledge from our experts and we are going to gain uh, something from them. Our guest of honor for the society is, is Dr. Punita Hasija ma'am, and she is consultant OBGYN, and she is running a nursing home in the name of Akriti Nursing Home at Faridabad. She is president IMA Faridabad, and she is vice president IMA Haryana State, and she is president elect IMA State Haryana State 2020, and she is also vice president of Faridabad Obs and Gynae Society. And above all, she is friend of all, and she is a very dynamic person, and we always love her, and juniors always respect her. She has a good name in the society. And our next, our expert faculty is Dr. Mala Arora ma'am. She is academician par excellence. She is guide for all of us. She is founder president of Faridabad Obs and Gynae Society, and she has many books to her credit. She has been chief editor of Recurrent Pregnancy Laws and Bird Clinic in Obs and Gynae Journal, Volume 1 to 10. She has got DC Datta Award for Year Book of Obs and Gynae book. It is a very good book for all of us. And she is chief editor to first trimester pregnancy in hyperhomocystinemia, and she is associate editor of International Journal of Infertility and Fetal Medicine, and she has peer reviewed many journals, and including British Journal of Obs and Gynae and Journal of Human Reproductive Science. Welcome to you, dear ma'am, and please say a few words for the society, and then Dr. Punita Hasija will say a few words for the society. Thank you, ma'am, and welcome to the Faridabad Obs and Gynae Society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Kiran, Dr. Chanchal, for inviting me to this webinar as expert faculty. And I am extremely happy that our guest of honor is being felicitated by Faridabad Society, Dr. Punita Hasija. She has won the hearts of one and all during this COVID vaccine program. She has worked so hard and has been so helpful to every member of the fraternity in achieving 100% vaccination goal for the healthcare workers. So thank you, Punita, for all the effort put in. We really deeply appreciate it. And I'm so happy that you have these two talks on fetal medicine, rhesus negative immunization by two very eminent speakers, Dr. Ritu Khanna and Dr. Nitin Choubal. I'm really looking forward to their talks and to learn something from their talks as well as make some expert comments. Thank you, Kiran.
Dr. Punita Hajiza ma'am.
Hello, good evening, one and all. Thanks, dear Kirandi and Dr. Mala ma'am, and dear Dr. Chanchal, for the very kind words of appreciation. I think, ma'am, I am all because of you only, ma'am,
Oh, no.
because I was one of the, I think, junior most of OBGYN student, you can say,
No.
this IT, ma'am, and you all made me this president of IMA Faridabad. And because of your efforts only, I could continue with doing all these works. And really thankful to Dr. Kiran Didi for honoring me on this platform. And thanks to Dr. Chanchal. You are also a good friend. And I'm looking forward to listen to Dr. Ritu ma'am and Dr. Nitin sir. And Dr. Deepika Chhabra is also there. I welcome to all the participants of this webinar, and thanks for the Kiran Didi, because I am one of you only. Please don't call me ma'am. I'm very junior. Please don't call me ma'am. Call me Punita only. It will be nice to listen to everyone, and a good evening to all the chairpersons also. Thank you so
Punita,
much.
you as state president of IMA and one day the national president of IMA. So
Thank you.
continue on the journey.
Ma'am, okay, ma'am. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks for the kind word. Go to you, Chanchal.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Punita, and thank you, Dr. Mala, ma'am. Now we move on to our academic program, for which I would like to invite the chairpersons for today. We have Dr. Sangeeta Sood Chopra. She is Director and Consultant Obstetrics and Gynae at Chopra Medical Center, Faridabad. Dr. Sangeeta, ma'am, is a very busy practitioner. Besides that, she is a very ever smiling person, as I know. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Now we have next chairperson as Dr. Anjali Dikshit. Has she joined?
Yes,
Yeah.
she has.
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Anjali is Director and Senior Consultant at Anjali Nursing Home, Faridabad, and she is a very hardworking practitioner. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you to be here.
Dr. Priyanka Sharma. She is one of our young brigades of our team. She is Associate Professor, Department of Obs and Gynae at ESIC Medical College, Faridabad. She is a gold medalist during her MD and a keen interest in academics and maternal fetal medicine. Welcome, Dr. Priyanka. Next we have is Dr. Supriya. Dr. Supriya Rastogi. She had her fellowship in neonatology. She is working as a consultant neonatology at Savera Child Clinic, Faridabad. Welcome, Dr. Supriya.
Thank you, ma'am. It's an honor to be present here as a chair. Thank you.
Okay. Now we move on. First speaker for today is Dr. Ritu Khanna, ma'am. She would be speaking on how to manage Rh negative pregnancies. This topic as such remains to be quite untouched in our webinars, in our CMEs. And so we thought of choosing this topic, and ma'am, none other than ma'am could justify this topic. Welcome you, ma'am, to Faridabad Society. Ma'am is a chairperson elect Foxy Food and Drug Medico-Surgical Equipment Committee. She's Secretary Society of Fetal Medicine Varanasi Chapter, Vice Chairperson Women Doctors Wing IMA Banaras Branch, and she's Vice President WOGS 2019 and 20. She had been Secretary of WOGS in 2018 and 19, Joint Treasurer Indian Fertility Society in 18 and 20, co-conveners SIG IFS Ultrasound 2018 and 20, Scientific Secretary IMS Varanasi Chapter 2021, and Organizing Secretary UPCOG 2019, and Organizing Secretary Fertivision 2016. Ma'am is exclusive single embryo transfer. She's working on exclusive single embryo transfer. She has many awards to her credit and various publications, many papers on male and female infertility published her first Indian study on the infertility, and her field of interest are laparoscopy and hysteroscopy in fertility enhancing surgeries, and ultrasound, color Doppler, 3D, 4D, and so on. Welcome you, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Chanchal, and also the chairpersons, Dr. Sangeeta, Dr. Anjali, Dr. Priyanka, Dr. Supriya, and respected Dr. Punita Hasija, the guest of honor for today, and the President, IMA Faridabad, and our mentor and guide, Dr. Mala Arora ma'am, who's the founder president of Faridabad Obstetric and Gynec Society. And also Dr. Kiran Chandana, whose kind invitation, and she's the president of Faridabad Obstetric Gynec Society, and also Professor Emeritus Dr. Nitin Chaubal as the speaker today. Thank you so much for inviting me here and giving me this opportunity to be here in this august gathering. And it's your love and hospitality that brings me here always to Faridabad Society. So it's an honor and rather a privilege for me also. So to begin with my presentation here today, it's RH isoimmunization with the recent updates. More than 35 blood group systems are recognized, and there are so many like ABO, RH, KEL, Duffy, etc. And most of these group antigens have been found to be associated with the hemolytic disease. But ABO-RH accounts for 98% of these. So we have got two robust groupings, and that's the ABO system and the RH system. So we know about A, B, ABO, and O. Type A has the anti-B antibodies. Type B has the anti-A antibodies. Type AB has neither A nor B antibodies. And O has anti-A and anti-B antibodies. So now the fetus is going to inherit one gene from each parent, and they are present on chromosome 9. So 20% of the ABO incompatibility of the mother and fetus, and only 5% still only chance of developing the hemolytic disease. Now, the RH antigens. At present, the RH blood group consists of around 50 defined blood group antigens, among which the 5 antigens D and small d, C, C, E, E are the most important. The RH antigen appears on the 38th day of life and then remains lifelong. So the genotype is determined by the inheritance of the 3 pairs from each parent, closely linked allelic genes situated on chromosome 1, named as C, C, D, and EE. Because the small d gene has no antigenic expression, so there are only 5 effective antigens. And these are the most frequent genotypes that we encounter. So D positive person could be either heterozygous or could be homozygous. So now if the D positive father is homozygous, then 100% of the Rh positive babies would be Rh positive. If he's heterozygous, then 50% Rh would be positive babies. Almost 50% of the D positive people are heterozygous. Now, odds of the baby being positive in an Rh incompatible couple where the father's genotype is not known is around 67.5%. So globally, if we look into the incidence, we find that the Basque population of the Spain has the highest incidence of around 30 to 35%. And if you go to the Asians, it goes as low as 2% or less. The Rh factor is a protein. It's found on the RBCs of most people. And when a person does not have this factor and it's Rh negative, now when this Rh negative mother is exposed to an Rh positive red blood cell, then she may produce antibodies in her blood, and that's called as an isoimmunization or an alloimmunization. It's an immune response in an individual of one species to an antigen from a different individual of the same species. Its iso is same as allo, but if it's one's own antigen, then it's called as an auto. If it's an antigen from a different species, it's called as a xeno. Now these antibodies would cross to the fetus across the placenta, and there it's going to form complexes with the Rh positive fetal red cells. Now these affected RBCs will then be destroyed by the reticuloendothelial system of the fetus. So the Rh negative mother carrying an Rh positive fetus, the entry of the Rh positive RBCs into the maternal circulation, maybe it's a fetal-maternal hemorrhage, and thereby in the mother, there's a development of Rh antibodies. Now this fetal-maternal hemorrhage, it occurs 10% during pregnancy, but look what happens during delivery. It's almost 90% of the fetal-maternal hemorrhage is going to occur over there. So there are so many sensitizing events for the Rh isoimmunization, and it's antepartum. It could be miscarriages or retained products of conception, or it could be the ectopic pregnancies or the obstetric procedures could be there, and amniocentesis, Korean villus sampling, doing external cephalic version. It may be a complete, it may not be a complete version done, or a fetal blood sampling being done, intra-utero blood transfusions, any blunt trauma, a forceps delivery, cesarean sections, stillbirths, multiple pregnancy, hydrops, placental abruption, or any Mandel-Rebola placenta. Sometimes there may be an inadvertent infusion of any Rh positive blood, or a platelet transfusion could also be there. So the spontaneous miscarriages, especially when they are with the intervention or a therapeutic termination of pregnancy, an ectopic or a molar pregnancy, all should be receiving the anti-D, regardless of the method of their management. And threatened miscarriages, there are different guidelines. Some say that whenever it's associated with cramps, it needs anti-D. Any invasive prenatal diagnostic procedures which are being done, or the intrauterine procedures like the insertion of shunts or the embryo reduction also. So the potential sensitizing events like the antepartum hemorrhage, the external cephalic version, the abdominal trauma, the intrauterine death and stillbirths also, and the delivery, whether normal, whether instrumental or cesarean, or any intraoperative cell salvage causes a fetal-maternal hemorrhage. Now, if we look into this, the fetal RBCs, they have been detected in the maternal blood in all the 3 trimesters. If we look into this chart, even when there's not an apparent predisposing factor, yet we find 7, 16, and 29% being detected in all the 3 trimesters. In this chart, if we see it's 0.07, 0.08, 0.13, and so on. So the chances of fetal-maternal hemorrhage are only 5% in the first trimester, but 47% of them occurring in the third, and it's maximum 75% at the time of delivery. So the chances of primary sensitization during the first pregnancy is only 1 to 2%. So ABO incompatibility protects from the Rh disease. So the initial response, the maternal response to the sensitization is the low levels of immunoglobulin, and these are IgM antibodies. Now these antibodies having high molecular weight, they're not able to cross the placenta. So the first pregnancy, sensitizing pregnancy, the most fetal-maternal hemorrhage occurs during delivery. There's still going to be a very weak IgM response, not crossing the placenta, and hence the first baby is not affected. What happens after this is within the next 6 weeks to 6 months, the IgG antibodies are being formed. There's sensitization of the B lymphocytes, and then there is a storage of this memory. Now, these IgG antibodies will be able to cross the placenta, and thereby the fetal Rh positive cells will be destroyed. So the firstborn infants with Rh positive blood type will not be affected. The short exposure of the mother to the fetal RBCs is insufficient to produce the IgG antibodies which would have crossed the placenta. So subsequent pregnancies, sensitized pregnancies, Rh positive fetus, fetal-maternal hemorrhage occurs, there's going to be an amnestic IgG response, and this IgG crosses the placenta, leading to fetal cell hemolysis, congenital anemia of the newborn, the hydrops, fetal hyperbilirubinemia, and icterus gravis also could occur. So the outcome goes on worsening after every pregnancy. Now, what is the amount of the hemorrhage that is required? The amount of fetal blood necessary is as little as 0.1 ml of the Rh positive, and that's been documented. But studies have also shown that 30% of the people with Rh negative blood never develop Rh incompatibility, even when challenged with large amounts of Rh positive blood. So if we go into the volume and compare the sensitization, 0.1 ml, the risk is 3%, but as it increases, if it's more than 5, it goes as high as 65%. So there is something called as a grandmother effect or the theory, and it's very interesting. In all the pregnancies, we looked into it, maybe any trimester, there is small amount of maternal blood which is going to enter the fetal circulation. And if you do a PCR, has been used to identify the maternal D positive DNA in peripheral blood from the preterm, full-term D negative newborns. So possible that a D negative female fetus has been exposed to the D maternal positive RBCs to develop the sensitization. So now when this individual, which was in the womb of the mother, is going to grow into an adult, she may produce anti-D antibodies even before or early in the first pregnancy. And this is called as a grandmother effect or the theory, because the fetus in the current pregnancy is jeopardized by the maternal antibodies initially provoked by his or her grandmother's erythrocytes. So the Rh negative fetus and the mother was positive. The fetus was exposed to Rh antigen through the maternal fetal transplacental bleed. The fetus immune system developed a permanent template for the Rh positive antigen. And when the fetus became a mother exposed to a new load of D antigen from a fetus, the immune memory is recalled, and therefore the secondary immune response occurs. So maternal IgG enters the fetal circulation via the placenta. There is now going to be the destruction of the RBCs. And when the cell destruction exceeds the production, then it's going to be a severe anemia. And fetal anemia occurs when the hematocrit is less than 30%. The hem is formed, it's being converted into bilirubin, and it's causing the fetal hyperbilirubinemia. And therefore, both are neurotoxic, and they are at present being effectively cleared by the placenta and metabolized by the mother. So the more the demand on the extramedullary sites is there to produce the red cells, we'll find that lot of immature erythroblasts are going to be produced. So the liver and the spleen seem to be enlarged. The heart failure eventually results with ascites, edema, and pericardial effusion. There's going to be erythroblastosis fetalis, and hydrocephalus occurs when the hematocrit still falls down to less than 15% and often results in the fetal death shortly before or after birth. And we know that the male to female fetus is 13:1 is the ratio. So this we've already taken. So after birth, the antigen antibody reaction on the RBC surfaces, hemolysis, anemia, jaundice, connectors, and thereby the neonatal death could occur. Now, if this neonate is affected mildly, this could be tolerated by fetus, and this mild anemia and jaundice at birth usually resolves without any treatment. But if it's a moderate, increased circulating bilirubin being cleared by the placenta, after birth, the bilirubin not cleared by immature liver, so there's a hyperbilirubinemia, connectress, moderate anemia, postnatal would occur. If it is severe, then yes, hepatosplenomegaly, erythroblastosis, and so on and on this goes. Now, what is our basic objective over here? The basic objective is we want to prevent this Rh alloimmunization in the Rh negative women who is unsensitized, and there lies the role of prophylaxis anti-D. And second would be you just early detect and treat the fetal anemia if the women is sensitized. And for determining the sensitization, we have the indirect Combs test, which is also called as the antibody screen test. So before we start managing, we just go on exploring into the history. If she had a blood transfusion, is she ABO-RH type of the patient and the spouse, and all previous pregnancies, we want the histories and the outcome and the intervention, because if she had a history of high drops, there would be a 90% chance of a recurrence, and previous administration of any anti-D or mechanism of injury in cases of any trauma or vaginal bleeding or any invasive procedure. So we need a prophylaxis if she's not sensitized, and we need the managing sensitized women as per whatever the case would be. So if she's not sensitized, we get the ABO-RH of the husband done. If the husband is Rh negative, there's no problem at all. If the husband is Rh positive, we need to check with homozygous or heterozygous and also do an indirect Combs test. Now, if the ICT is negative, there comes the role of the role of anti-D, because we want to prevent any alloimmunization. And also the second role over here is minimize any chances of fetal-maternal hemorrhage. So we do an ICT test, and therefore we give a prophylaxis at 28 weeks to all non-sensitized Rh negative mothers, 300 microgram as a single dose, or some guidelines to recommend 100 micrograms at 28 and 34 weeks. Further dose of 300 micrograms postpartum. And if the baby is Rh positive, it could be given for 14 to 28 days also, but the protection would be a little less. So all Rh sensitization events which occur before 12 weeks, we give 50 to 150 micrograms. If they're occurring after 12 weeks, it's 150 to 300. But what about the large fetal-maternal hemorrhage? If ever there is a large fetal-maternal hemorrhage, then yes, we need to calculate the dosage. So how do we do this? We could do the Rosette test. It's just a qualitative assay. The maternal blood is mixed with the anti-day reagent and the D plus indicator, the red cells are seen. You'll find clumps like this. If the clumps are more than 3, then yes, there is a positive Rosette test. Then you have to go in for a Kleher-Betke test also, which is an acid elution test. The maternal blood is taken. We know that the HbF is resistant to the acid elution. So these are the bright pink fetal cells that we are going to see. And we count 2,000 of these cells, and number of fetal cells divided by 2,000 into the blood volume is how you calculate the fetal blood in milliliters. And so one fetal blood, you need 10 micrograms of anti-D. If there were 36 fetal RBCs that you calculated, so you require, it's a 90 ml of fetal blood, that means you need 3 vials of 300 microgram to be done. And also the flow cytometry could be used to find out this large fetal-maternal hemorrhage. So at birth, the maternal blood sample then would be taken for the antibodies by ICT for fetal red blood cells, and the neonatal cord blood for the antibodies by the direct Coombs test, or the infant blood group, infant bilirubin level, hemoglobin, as well as the hematocrit could be done. So now if the neonatal blood group at trace is positive, no antibodies detected in the mother, you give a full dose of 300 micrograms to the mother within the first 72 hours after the delivery. This entity is a polyclonal antibody, we know, and 300 microgram that we are going to give, it's going to cover 15 milliliters of the fetal RBCs or 30 milliliters of the fetal blood. And the half-life is 16 to 24 days. And we all know that we're not going to give it on the gluteal, but we give it on the deltoid or the anterolateral aspect of the thigh. And this anti-D is going to bind to the fetal RBCs and thereby preventing the stimulation of the maternal immune system. So now the risk and sensitivity, let's see what has happened. Without prophylaxis, when there were no prophylaxis, antenatal or postnatal, the risk was as high as 16% after 2 deliveries, but 1.5 to 2% it occurred antepartum, 7% within 6 months, and 7% early in the second trimester. And when you gave the prophylaxis, this really drastically came down to 0.1%. So before anti-D isoimmunization, it was 16%. After we started giving the postnatal anti-D, it was 2%. But look what happened when we started with the antenatal prophylaxis, that is the anti-D, it came to 0.17 to 0.28%. So mortality, which was associated with the hemolytic disease, reduced from 46 per 100,000 to 1.6 per 100,000. But certain women may still be non-sensitized. There may be a failure of prophylaxis, the dose may have been too small, or it would have been too late to give a protective effect, and the patient already immunized, but the antibody titer too low for the lab to recognize, or a defective immunoglobulin also may have been given. So now what would happen if this woman was Rh sensitized pregnant woman? The sensitization risk would depend on the volume of the transplacental hemorrhage, the extent of the maternal immune response, and also the concurrent presence of the ABO incompatibility, which gives a protective role, and the risk drops to 1.5 to 2%. So there could be various causes: a misinterpretation of the Rh type, it could be an Rh positive blood transfusion, an unprotected pregnancy labor, or an inadequate dose of anti-D, which was given on any previous occasion. So the first visit, what we do is we just do an antibody level titer. So if it reflects the potential for anemia, now we look into the titer. at which the critical, if it's 1:16 is the critical titer. So then you start doing your serial ultrasound scans and monitor every 2 weeks of this patient. If antibody levels continues at the same, there's no fetal compromise, then you could just carry on to term. So this is the antibody titer we did. If it's less than 1:16, you do an ICT every 4 weeks. And of course, you deliver her, take her to term, or 37 weeks at least. If it's more than 1:16, yes, these days now we do the middle cerebral artery peak systolic velocity is done. So the fetal effects would be fetal anemia. We could use the ultrasound to document it, or the hydrops, or the fetal hyperbilirubinemia. So we've got various options what to do and what not to do. We had the amniocentesis, but now it's an older method being replaced by today's the middle cerebral artery Doppler. And it's done when you have the ICT more than 1:16. If there's a previous history of infant being affected, and it's usually done after 27 weeks, we have to avoid the placenta. So we used to do amniocentesis, taking the optical density 450. That's a bilirubin level which reflects the RBC's hemolysis. And at 450, it's proportional to the level of bilirubin in the amniotic fluid. And this is plotted on the Lilly's graph. Now, this Lilly's chart and the Quinan chart are the two charts. This was not accurate before 26 weeks, but this could be used from 14 plus to 40 weeks, and it was 10% superior to the Lilly's curve that was being used. So according to this Lilly's chart, if they were falling into zone 2, that's mild to moderate, and the zone 3, which was a severe fetal anemia with the high probability of fetal death in the next 7 to 10 days. Chordosynthesis was another method, which we could just see also the hemoglobin and this of the fetus, doing a DCT also. So when you're doing an ultrasound, there's so many suspicious parameters for a severe infection. You could have a thick placenta, the umbilical vein diameter is increasing, and the hepatic size and the splenic size is increasing. There could be polyhydramnios, and the visualization of the fetal bowels due to the small amount of the amniotic fluid, and that's a first sign of hydrops fetalis that's going to occur. So the ultrasound would help us to monitor the scalp and the skin edema, and slowly we keep getting the ascites, pericardial effusion, polyhydramnios, and the cardiomegaly. The placental hypertrophy and enlargement could be seen. It's just an effort to increase the transfer of oxygen by the available fetal red cells. And later, the ascites, the effusion, the edema, the cardiomegaly, and also this Buddha sign that we see on the X-ray pictures are, of course, the classical presentation of hydrops. So nowadays, we use the middle cerebral artery, which is much more accurate, it's non-invasive, and the value for peak systolic velocity correlates with the severity of anemia. We can repeat it, and it's well accepted too. It's 100% sensitivity and less amounts of false positive with this. And of course, it's resulted into 80% reduction in the invasive test now, but we do not do it before 18 weeks because the reticuloendothelial system is immature to hemolyze enough cells to cause so much of anemia. And after 35 weeks, of course, it's not a very reliable parameter. So if there's a normal middle cerebral artery, the Doppler is repeated monthly and just carry on. You can take her till term or at least up to 37 weeks. If it is moderately affected, that is 1.5 multiples of the median, then you repeat every 1 to 2 weeks and deliver after the lung maturity, and you need an enhancement, you could do it. But if she's severely affected, that's more than 1.5 or the frank evidence of fetal hydrops, then you need to attain lung maturity before delivery, and because there's a high risk of intrauterine death. So this is what we were going along to. And if she's more than 34, yes. If it's less than, you do a fetal blood sampling, you determine the hematocrit. It's less than 30, you could go in for an intrauterine transfusion. More than 30, then you have to keep on following her. So severe fetal anemia could be confirmed by amnio or Gordo or the ultrasound signs which are being used nowadays. And of course, then you need to take them for the corrective treatment of anemia fetal by the intrauterine transfusion. So intrauterine transfusion, I think 80 to 90% severely anemic babies could be saved by this. It's typically carried between 18 to 35, and it's done intraperitoneally or umbilical vein, or both could be done. And the hematocrit, when it goes less than 30%, we need O negative packed cells, which have a hematocrit of around 80%, and cross-match with the mother's blood. It should be fresh, less than a week, free of any infections. And how do we calculate is 0.02 into the fetal weight in grams So for approximately 1 kg, you have 20 mLs. And it's tightly packed to achieve hematocrit of 75 to 85%. And the procedure, I think Dr. Nitin Chabal will be better able to guide us with the procedures also. So I would skip this. And then we keep on monitoring is done with the middle cerebral artery PSV, and subsequent transfusion, yes, could be planned depending upon the monitoring by the ultrasound, which has to take on. So this intrauterine transfusion has become increasingly common. It's a very safe procedure, and we need a fetal medicine expert and better understanding. And after this, a dramatic improvement can be seen in the middle cerebral artery peak systolic value, which indicates that yes, this intrauterine transfusion is successful. And this beautiful picture, this was the middle cerebral artery pictures. And after that, when the post intrauterine transfusion, this is the monitoring and the pictures to be done. So we have a lot of alternative treatments for the severely immunized and plasmapheresis, as they've been mentioned, steroids, promethazine and all. But I think still the early detection of fetal anemia with the middle cerebral artery and the intrauterine and timely delivery remains still the gold standard. Now, if she is RH sensitized women, she's mildly or severely affected, we need an experienced team, and we need all arrangements for the neonatal ICU also for them. If it's a premature fetus with zone 2 or 3, the chordocentesis blood sample hemoglobin less than 10 gram per deciliter, ultrasound evidence of eye drops, consider transfer to a suitable place where all the facilities are available for intrauterine therapy and also for the delivery and neonatal care. Dexamethasone, yes, could be given to these to enhance the lung maturity. Severe forms of hemolytic could be indications for cesarean in term or 34 to 35 weeks after the previous antenatal prevention of the fetal hyaline membrane syndrome. So measures to be taken during the cesarean should be prevention of the spillage of blood from the placenta into the peritoneal cavity, spontaneous delivery using the control cord, don't squeeze the uterus, don't avulse the cord anyway, and the vaginal deliveries could be allowed to undergo till term 37, 30 weeks, 8 weeks. Induction of labor performed could be by a prostaglandin or by the oxytocin infusion could also be done. So no fundal pushing in the first and second stage, withhold methagen till after the anterior shoulder, early cord clamping and no milking. You leave a long length of the cord so that for any transfusions which may be required, there's no uterine massage to be done or squeezing even in the third stage. Let the placenta be spontaneously delivered to avoid avulsions and protect the vaginal and perineal wounds and from laceration being exposed to any of this fetal blood being spilled from the cord. So postpartum management involved a neonatologist, send all the cord samples for the hemoglobin, bilirubin, DCT, and the peripheral smear. If the fetus is negative RH, then no further intervention. And if it's positive, you determine the dose of the IgG to be administered. And we have all the 4 steps that we've already discussed. So estimate the volume and calculate the dose of the antid if it's a large fetal-maternal hemorrhage which has occurred. So managing the newborn, if it's a mild anemia, you just need a phototherapy. If it's moderate to severe, yes, exchange blood transfusions. Mild high drops, they still improve in 88%, and severe high drops, mortality is as high as 39%. So there are certain special fetal-maternal risk states. Abortions, 5% chances of sensitization. You give a 50 to 100 micrograms of the dose. Invasive fetal procedures, 11% sensitization. So always give a 300 microgram dose to be given. Antepartum hemorrhage, 300 microgram to be repeated 12 weeks later if the pregnancy lasts long. External cephalic version, 6% chances. So the dose is 300 micrograms. So the recent advances would be the NIPT, the cell-free DNA, which could be done in 14 to 16 weeks, and we could easily know the RH fetal status. And if the fetus is RH negative, we really do not need to give any prophylactic doses. Also, the direct estimation of NTD levels less than 4, low risk, and more than 15 as high risk of fetal anemia. Estimation of quantity of fetal hemorrhage using flow cytometry, and exclusive use of the middle cerebral from 18 weeks, and also the blood sampling for detection of the fetal anemia. So every woman of childbearing age should have a blood group RH done at the first contact, and also the husband's blood group and the hetero and homozygosity, and ensure that the ICT is done at 20, 24, 28 weeks with the appropriate prophylaxis, and a single postpartum dose may be inadequate. Sometimes if there's a lot of fetal maternal hemorrhage, and yes, we have a lot of problems that are setting, maybe the high cost of immunoglobulin, the lack of resource to adequately investigate, and low turnouts for the antenatal or poor documentation, and sometimes even the loss of case reports. So certain recommendation, and that's advocacy for the partnership by the government and the NGOs to help to subsidize this cost of immunoglobulin, the special insurance covers for the RH negative, so as to ease of procurement should be there, involvement of clergy as a part of premarital counselors, creation of a special group for RH negative people where potential RH negative spouses can be met. So with first introduced here, the postpartum administration, as we said, it reduced the aluminiization in risk pregnancies from 13 to 16% to approximately down to 0.5 to 1. And the risk further decreased to 0.1 to 0.2 with the addition of the antepartum administration. So despite condemnable proof of efficacy, there are still large number of cases because of failure to follow established protocols. In addition, there are new data to help guide management, especially with regards to the weak D phenotypes. So sometimes hope is the only thing. Life really hurts you when certain calamities occur. So the hope is only thing. And once you have it, I think you have everything. Thank you so much for a patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Ritu, for such a nice and elaborative talk on RH negative. It has enlightened us. Thanks a lot.
Ma'am, please unmute Dr. Sangeeta. Yeah, so I should invite the next speaker, Dr. Nitin Chaubal. And I welcome Dr. Nitin Chaubal for his talk on fetus as patient. He's a consultant in ultrasound in Jaslok Hospital and Research Center, Director, Thane Ultrasound Center, D.Y. Patil University, Navi Mumbai. And sir is a fellow of American Institute of Ultrasound in Medicine, USA. And he's a fellow of Society of Radiologists in Ultrasound, USA. And he's a fellow Indian College of Medical Ultrasound. And he's also a fellow of Indian College of Radiology. I welcome Dr. Nitin.
Yeah.
Welcome,
good afternoon. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I'll just share my screen. Great. So a very good afternoon to all of you, and it's a pleasure to be speaking in this society meet of Faridabad. I only hope that I could have come there physically. One more outing and meeting all of you would have been great. And regards to all the senior people who are guests as well as chairpersons for this meet. So it happened that some months back, I think Ritu spoke on this subject and I spoke on fetus as a patient. And somehow this thing probably clicked, and we have been now doing it very often together. And as long as people benefit, it's good for us. So it's high time that we started looking at the fetus as a patient with its own rights. And that is very important. And I'll come to this very important point at the end of this talk, that a fetus has its own right. Now, I have been in the field of ultrasound for more than 30 years. In fact, almost like 35 years maybe. And this book by Harrison was published in almost 30 years back. And this is the first time that we started thinking of the fetus as an unborn patient. We started thinking of the fetus not as something which we image, but something which is live and something which has to be looked upon as a patient or an unborn patient. And this was a big eye-opener for us. And of course, beyond, after that, there have been additions, and now of course we have entire societies of prenatal diagnosis, therapy, etc. But this was probably the beginning of looking at a fetus as a patient. And this video is very famous. This was the meningocele operation done, a fetal surgery when the fetus meningocele was repaired and the fetus was put back. One of the first times it happened in California, and the fetus actually removed its hand and held the surgeon's finger, saying thank you very much. And that's very, very touching indeed, that we have now touched the unborn patient. And back home in our own mythology, we know of Abhimanyu, who while he was in utero, when Subhadra was pregnant, Arjun told her how to penetrate the Chakravyuh, which was very difficult. So he heard that, and unfortunately Subhadra slept off, and then the story was half said, and we know the rest of the story. So, so this is for fact. I mean, this may be a mythology, but it happens. So now we know that a fetus can actually have hiccups, can react to loud noises. By the end of second trimester, it can hear. We know that very well. And fetus can have this rapid eye movement, sleep. The fetus can savor its mother's meals and first pick up the food taste of culture. Now, this is our personal experience, that my own daughter-in-law is a Bengali and she loves fish. And when she was pregnant, our baby, who is now 2 years old, used to jump inside whenever she ate fish, and he does the same thing now. So maybe all this is true. And then, of course, the fetus can distinguish between the mom's voice and the stranger, and it can respond to. That's why we have these Garbha Sanskar classes, which are very popular, where while during the pregnancy, people talk good things, so that good sort of a good the fetus hears good thing and has a similar sort of a nature. So very often when we did 3D ultrasound, we see various movements of fetus, various poses, and they're very interesting to see. For example, this guy is a big thinker. He's thinking, oh, what should I do next? This guy is a happy one, always smiling and quite happy being inside the womb. This guy is this guy is so happy that he's probably singing in. I'm sorry, I jumped one slide. This guy is so happy that he's probably singing inside the womb. Maybe he'll become a big singer there. And this guy is a naughty one, trying to do some tricks inside the uterus. And so we see all these things happening. This guy is angry. So we say, Albert Pinto ko gussa kyun aata hai? Why is he angry? We don't know. But there are various things which we try to. And these two are probably very sad, and they're crying inside for whatever reasons. Maybe they're not happy with what the mother has eaten or whatever be the fact. And sometimes we see fetal hiccups, and this is almost like a third trimester. We can see that the fetus diaphragmatic movement, if you look very carefully, there are jerks coming up, which are because of fetal hiccups, and you can see the head also moving with the hiccups. So these are all things which we usually see when we do ultrasound. And feti do get pain. So very often when we do amniocentesis, we can see that the fetus tries and grabs the needles with the fingers, and then sometimes you have to wait for the hand to go away. Sometimes if the leg is near the needle, they try and kick the needle away. So probably they get pain as well. And therefore, whenever we do longer procedures, like Ritu said, when we do transfusions, we need to anesthetize the fetus with the help of some injection in the thigh, which I'll show you. So typically nowadays we do 2 scans, and you're very familiar with that, the NT scan and the target scan. And in the bargain, we pick up a lot of anomalies, and some of these anomalies are fatal, and therefore, of course, we terminate. Some anomalies, of course, are not fatal, and that's where our role of fetal medicine or treating the fetus of the patient comes in, and we'll discuss those also. We also do a lot of diagnostic tests depending upon the situation. We might have to do amniocentesis, invasive tests like chorion villus sampling, as well as chordocentesis, depending upon what we want in a particular diagnosis. So in a day-to-day practice nowadays, we pick up Down syndrome very commonly. We pick up open neural tube defects very commonly at a very early stage. We used to pick them up in the second trimester. Now we pick them up most in the first trimester. And a good number of these feti, for good or for bad, are terminated because some of these malformations are very, very bad. But sometimes it is very important that we go to the end of investigations and do them very properly. For example, this is a fetus where we picked up a cleft lip and a cleft palate. Now, if you ask a pediatric surgeon or a plastic surgeon, oh, this is a cleft lip, what's the prognosis? No problem, I'll repair it. But it is very important that we do antenatal diagnostic tests, because when you see a newborn with a cleft lip, cleft palate, it's an entirely different ball game. A good number of them will not have any genetic problems and they can be repaired. There's some noise coming behind. I don't know if someone's mic is on or something like that. So if you can do that. And but it is very important to go to the do a proper investigation. For example, in this particular fetus, we did a microarray, and what we found is an abnormality in the 4th chromosome. And what we have here is a syndrome which is known as Wolff-Hichelon syndrome, where the entire face of the fetus is like a Greek face, Greek soldier's face, and that's what it mimics on a 3D view as well. Now, therefore, this is a very serious sort of an anomaly, not an ordinary face cleft lip and cleft palate. So this differentiation would come basically from an invasive testing, which is very, very important. And that is very important from the point of view of prognostication and from the point of view of counseling. Now, sometimes we pick up things like, for example, calcification in the brain. And one of the most common causes, as we know, is infections, like, for example, toxoplasmosis. But it is very important to do investigation, not just label something as an infection. For example, here, after seeing calcification, okay, we thought it could be infection. But when we looked at the fetus in detail, we saw a lot of other things. We saw depressed nasal bridge. We saw low set ears, which was seen better on 3D. That's a depressed nasal bridge. So we thought, oh, probably we are dealing with some syndrome. And then we thought of n number of differential diagnoses. Of course, we also thought of torch in mind. And therefore, we did a thorough gene analysis. And what we came out is what is known as a TREX1 AGS gene, which showed mutation. And this is very, very typical of what is known as Aicardi-Gautier syndrome, which is also known as a pseudo-torch syndrome. Now, this is important because not only from a prognostic point of view for this fetus, not only from the point of view of counseling, but also from the point of future pregnancies, because this is an autosomal recessive encephalopathy. So we need to think not only of this pregnancy, but we need to think of future also. And therefore, it is very important to do the antenatal test very, very carefully. Now, a lot of disorders which were picked up after the babies were born, like thalassemia, hemophilia, etc., are now very easily picked up antenatally. And therefore, for example, in India, thalassemia we know is very common in some of the communities. And here's an example of a husband and wife, both were thalassemia minor. So we know that if both the husband and the wife are thalassemia minor, then there is a 25% chance that you could have an affected thalassemic fetus as well. So rightly so, what we did is a Korean mirror sampling in this particular pregnancy, and we picked up a thalassemia in the fetus as early as 12 weeks of gestation, and the parents opted for termination of the pregnancy, which is their decision. We'll come to that particular point a little later. Similarly, here we had a couple where the couple was fine. The mother was a carrier of hemophilia, and when we traced the history, one of the brother and one of the cousins were again hemophilics. So we know that hemophilia is an X-linked recessive disorder. So the mother may be the carrier, but the fetus could be affected. And therefore, again, we did a CVS, and rightly so, we know that if the mother is a carrier, there's a 25% chance that we could have a affected fetus as such. And rightly so, when we did a CVS for this particular pregnancy, we did find a mutation in the FF gene, which of course suggests that this fetus is a hemophilia. Now, the issue, which is more like a social issue, is hemophilia is not a fatal disorder. I mean, people live with hemophilia for the life. They can take supplementary factor VIII, etc. But so should such pregnancies be terminated, which is a debatable question, but which is up to the parents at that particular stage what they want to do. So we will leave this particular issue at this particular point of time. Now, this is a very common scene. A patient is pregnant and they walk in with a baby who is mentally retarded or mentally challenged, I would say. I will not use the term retarded. And then they say, now that I'm pregnant, this is my first child, find out if this child is also having a similar problem. The problem here is that most of the times, for example, here, this is a 3-year-old baby, but the child was not properly evaluated. What happens in a day-to-day practice is these children go from one center to the other. Because the tests are very expensive, somewhere they leave the test halfway. And this child had hypoxia of birth. So, but the features were not like hypoxic encephalopathy. So when we saw this child, we said, no, if you want us to investigate the fetus, we need to investigate the proband very thoroughly. So when we investigated this child, we found out that this child had a mucopolysaccharidosis disorder, which is, of course, we did from his leukocyte as well as from his gene mapping. And once you know the disorder, once you know the gene, then we can do, we did a placental biopsy because she was already 15 weeks by the time we came to the proband diagnosis. And then of course we did an enzymatic assay of gene, and we found that this particular fetus was normal. So we reassured them and everything was fine. So it is very important, therefore, that as obstetricians, remember that if you have a pregnancy where the fetus child has some sort of a mental developmental problem, it is very important to go to the root of it, whether it's a Fragile X syndrome, whether there's something else, before the lady becomes pregnant, so that we can offer antenatal tests at a very, very early stage. So nowadays, very often we have we have a counseling center. Ours was one of the first counseling centers in the country after Dr. Suresh many years back, and we still have a very good team. So very often, this is a very common problem. At least once a month, we have parents coming with autistic children. Now, autism is nothing fatal, and I would say it's more like a behavioral disorder, and it is more like it is a huge spectrum with various manifestations also. So, though this is not I would say a fatal thing, but it can cause disturbance to the parents. And nowadays we have genetic studies available for autism. In fact, earlier we thought that 60-70% of autism have some genetic predisposition. Now it is believed that almost 90 to 100% of them have some sort of a genetic predisposition. So for example, this is a lady who came to us very recently, 35 years old, and she had one child which was autistic. And this is just a representative picture. This is not a true picture. So we did gene analysis for this particular child, and we found that this child has what is known as a Tentani syndrome. Though it's not a very classical Tentani syndrome, the gene analysis tells us that. Now, once we know this, then we can now analyze this particular fetus, which we are going to do, in fact, next week, this week itself, and then we'll find out whether the problem is there or no. Okay, so autism has a variety of manifestation. It may not be very bad every time. It can be very subtle. It may be difficult to diagnose. So whether to pick it up every time and what decisions to take is again a debatable thing, which we will not discuss on. I mean, that's a very big issue which we discussed during counseling meets, and it's also got social implications also. So one day when we were about to wind up, in our center, one lady again walked in from a neighboring town, and she brought this child with her. This is a 13-year-old boy, and we said, okay, this is my first child. Now I'm pregnant. Now you tell me whether this child has got a diagnosis. Whether the fetus has this problem or not. So after seeing this, of course, I thought, okay, this looks like progeria. But I didn't know anything about progeria because I had seen the movie Pa, but beyond that, my knowledge was very limited about this disorder. So, but we don't show them to the patient, okay, I'm seeing this for the first time. So we said, okay, fine, we will work it out, give all the papers. So we got the papers, and we studied. Of course, they had not done gene analysis also. So then we came to know more about progeria, which is a beautiful picture by Amitabh. And we know that in progeria, there is an abnormal shaped nucleus, and there's a problem with prelamin A protein, and we have a gene which is responsible for that. So after this, we did a proband study for the affected child. We found out the gene. Then we did an amniocentesis for this lady when she was pregnant, and so that this the fetus inside was not affected. There was no mutation also. She continued with the pregnancy, and now she has a very healthy child. So here, I think we again prevented the family from having a similar sort of a problem coming up again. Of course, the first baby also had a mutation, so it was less likely that there would be a sort of an inherent patterns. But it is very important that we pick this up when the patients come to us for a specific answer. So then, of course, we can also sort of plan the deliveries depending upon what sort of severity we see. For example, this is a doctor. She came to us almost in third trimester. And what we pick up is an interrupted aortic arch. The aorta is not forming a V right up to the end of the ductal arch. And that's very classical of interrupted aortic arch. So we thought this could be something like a DiGeorge syndrome, which is associated with aortic arch abnormalities. So what we did is, because she had come late, we did a chordosynthesis. So that's a needle going through the placenta into the umbilical vein, and we did a photosynthesis. And to our surprise, what we got is a partial deletion of chromosome 5p, which is known as a Cleveland syndrome. So typically here there is a deletion on the fifth pair of chromosome. And so what happens is when these children cry, or typically they have a sort of high pitched cry like a cat, and therefore it is known as a cry-do-chart syndrome. And very often the prognosis is not very good. So what happened in this? So they were ready at the time of delivery that not to do anything very heroic for this particular baby. The patient also wished that, and rightly so. This is the type of a cry which the children give. I don't know whether you're hearing it, which is, and that's the facial abnormality. Of course, these children can leave, but this particular child had a lot of other abnormalities and unfortunately could not make it. So then comes to actual treatment. So the first part which we discussed is making a diagnosis in utero of several disorders which could have been potentially picked up after birth. And depending upon what the disorder is, it is usually up to the parents to decide what sort of what they would like to do. And I'll discuss this point again at the end. It's a very important social point. Then comes to treatment. And as Ritu said, fetal anemia because of Rh incompatibility is one thing where fetal therapy has been almost 100% successful. I would not say 100%, but definitely at least 90% successful after fetal transfusion. So here we had a lady who was 35 years old, Rh negative. She came from a village with histories of three IUFDs because everything was in the village and they just left it to nature and it happened. So she came to us for the fourth time, and she came directly at 21 weeks. And what we see is a full-blown hydrops with hydramnios. And of course, as Ritu said, you pick up anemia by looking at MCA Doppler. The MCA Doppler showed very high velocities, almost 90 centimeters per second, telling us that it's. So now, with this history and this fetus, I don't require Coombs test also. So what we did is just prepare her for transfusion first, because fetus is anemic, whatever it is. So, so we can basically, once you have an MCA of such a high magnitude, we can find out whether it is definitely going to go above the mom and the fetus requires transfusion. So what we do in situation is prepare them for transfusion. At that time, we will check the blood also. So typically, as I said, that when you want to do anything longer, then we typically like to give vercuramine or pancuromine in the fetal thigh so that the fetus lies still for at least about 1 hour, 1.5 hours till your procedure is over. And this is something which we do very commonly. So that's an intramuscular injection being given in the fetal thigh. Then, of course, we go into the umbilical vein. Here, the placenta is posterior. Sometimes posterior placentas can be difficult. So we might have to go into the fetal abdomen. So we are puncturing the umbilical vein there. And what we do is once we puncture, then we send the blood for evaluation. So we have bulbs ready. Someone is ready. If the lab is not in-house, then someone is ready with a motorcycle to just take the blood to the lab. And once the blood is taken up, we start the transfusion. So in the meantime, you get a phone call from the lab. How much is the fetal hematocrit? In the meantime, you have already prepared O negative blood, CMV negative, washed, irradiated, cross-matched with the mother, etc. Sorry. So we start off with the transfusion directly. So by the time you come to know the fetal hematocrit, then you can calculate the approximate amount of blood you want to transfuse. But typically, you would have to transfuse roughly about say 50-60 ml of blood every time, most of the times. So you can start the transfusion. Don't wait for the hematocrit report also to come. Then, of course, you can run the blood groups, etc. on the fetus, but anemia needs to be corrected as fast as possible. So as soon as you give transfusion, usually the MCA Doppler comes back to normal. Typically, we look at the MCA Doppler. We also look at ductus venosus to make sure that we are not overloading the heart. But of course, this is at 21 weeks. So this fetus required 3 transfusions. So this is again after about a matter of about, I think, 4 weeks, we had to transfuse again. Again, MCA PSV going down, post-transfusion coming up. And then, of course, we had a third transfusion also. So MCA also, Ritu said that it is not very sensitive early, typically below 18. Even after repeated transfusions, MCA Doppler has a limitations, which we need to keep in mind as well. But what is interesting is that we had one beautiful baby born at around 36 weeks of gestation. There was no transfusion required at all after birth. and that was a very healthy baby. So this is very heartening. Once you see all this happening, the baby being born and smiling and all, you also feel good about the whole thing. And as I said, this is one therapy which is very successful all across our country as well as outside as well. There are other conditions where you can treat fetus in utero. For example, this is a lady who was 30 years old, G2P1, and she had a history of hyperthyroidism, and she was put on neomercazole and of course PTU. Now the whole problem is that she took these medicines without any control. I mean, someone prescribed her something once, and then she never went back to that person, or she went to some other person. She went on taking those sort of anti-thyroid drugs, and she came to us at 26 weeks directly. And what we saw is a huge polyhydramnios, huge thyroid, which was extremely vascular. So that's a fetal goiter there. So now we have charts for different gestational age. So we measure the circumference of the thyroid, and we know that, okay, this is definitely an enlarged. So the next thing we need to find out is the fetal thyroid function. So nowadays what we do is, of course, we do a cord blood and find out the thyroid function, but we can also do it from the amniotic fluid. And what we found is that the TSH levels were very high in the fetus, which means that the fetus is hypothyroid. So we know that if you leave it alone, this is a born cretin, which is going to have a worse prognosis, or may not even make it up to the full term, or even after birth, very, very difficult. So what we did in this case is injected thyroxine in the amniotic fluid, which absorbs, which the fetus takes up much better than giving thyroxine to the mother. So basically here we injected thyroxine in the amniotic fluid. You can see the bubbles coming up, and we had to do it in this particular condition for almost about 3 times. And at around 32 weeks past, the thyroid size, of course, decreased. The vascularity decreased significantly. And then we did a thyroid function test for the baby fetus again, and we found that the TSH level had dropped, telling us that things are going in the right manner. And again, we delivered her almost at term, and there was no swelling at all at the neck. The thyroid functions were normal, and this child is doing very well. So that's at 1 month, that's 6 months. Now this child is almost, I think, 7-8 years old. And a good thing is that some of these parents, who are grateful to us, they bring these children to the clinic for their birthdays. And we also know that, okay, so and so child is likely to come. So we give some gifts for them. And it's a fantastic feeling, I can tell you that. If we had not done this, we would have 100%, we would be born with a cretin, and how the stories can be. Fetal tachycardias, bradycardias can be treated very easily in utero. This is just one example that you may not appreciate it on a movie, but the ventricular rate and the atrial rates are well above 250. That's an atrial flutter there. So this was treated with digoxin. Of course, the patient was hospitalized in a closed hospital, monitored by an adult cardiologist as well as by us, and the heart rate came down, and we had a healthy baby. Of course, nowadays very often flecainide or sotalol are given, depending upon the availability and depending upon the expertise of the person treating. Then sometimes we might have to intervene in the fetus with needles. So for example, this is a fetus which was almost about 32 weeks of gestation, and we saw a large pleural effusion. Now, this was the isolated finding. There had been no other fluid like hydrops, ascites, soft tissue edema. So when you have an isolated pleural effusion, there is a possibility that this could be idiopathic, because very often when you see fluids, you think of hydrops, you think of RH incompatibility, you think of infections, etc. But fluid at one place, especially pleural, could be idiopathic. So we first did a tapping, of course, and then sent it for evaluation. And there was nothing suggestive of any diagnosis, so we thought it's idiopathic. So what we did is at 36 weeks, since we completely drained out the fluid, so that there was like a dry tap, you can see there's hardly any fluid there. And this fetus actually delivered within the next 2 weeks, around 37, 38 weeks. And the fetus has done very well. There was no pleural effusion, and we didn't have to do anything. If you pick it up early and it recurs, then of course we might have to do a pleuroamniotic shunt, put a shunt from the pleural cavity into the amniotic cavity. So similarly, when you have large CPAMs, with large macrocystic cytadenomas, sometimes they occupy the entire lung, and you might compromise, so that can compress the lungs and the heart can give rise to hydrops as well. So typically when you have very large macrocysts, we can again do shunting, or we can put, just drain it out or put a shunt like what we have done here from the cyst into the amniotic cavity. So if you know, if you must have seen a lot of CPAMs, and a good number of them actually resolve, by the time you go to 28, 29 weeks, you see the CPAMs going down, and very often we tell the patients the prognosis is good, which is true. But here in this case, the CPAM went on increasing in size, 29, 30, 31 weeks, and the size of the entire lesion went on increasing. So we were worried, and this was a mixed type of a lesion, cystic as well as microcystic. So what we did is we put in needle and drained out the multiple large cysts which were there. And this reduced the volume of the CPAM significantly. And then we observed her over a period of next 2-3 weeks, and we found a considerable decrease in the size of the CPAM. The CBR, which was well above 1 point, almost about 1.4, dropped to 0.5, 0.6. That was considerable decrease. We gave them steroids, of course, and delivered out this fetus again. And of course, CPAMs need to be looked at post-natally. So this child was asymptomatic, but on a CT scan, a small patch was seen because the original lesion was very large. And ultimately, the pediatric surgeon decided to resect it, but the child has done very, very well. Sometimes even that resection may not be required at all. So as I said, if it's a large macrocystic, then you might have to put a shunt from the large cyst into the amniotic fluid. If it is microcystic nowadays, you can also do an RFA or a laser. Then congenital diaphragmatic hernia, of course, in India, so far we don't treat them. But abroad, what is done in a good number of centers is plugging of the trachea. So once the trachea is plugged, the diaphragm is, the lung gets filled up with fluid, and that pushes the contents of the hernia back into the abdomen. The lung expands, develops well, and of course, we can have good results also. So we know that in diaphragmatic hernia, the problem is besides lung hypoplasia, pulmonary hypertension. So both these things can be prevented by a timely intervention. The other condition which is amenable to fetal intervention is fetal bladder obstructions, typically posterior urethral valves in a male fetus. Now, typically these present in two ways. One is they present at an early stage or early second trimester, where we have large bladders, posterior urethral dilated. By the time you see there is no liquor, the kidneys are hydronephrotic, dysplastic. This has a very bad prognosis. A good number of them have underlying genetic problem. But there is another group which typically comes late second trimester or sometimes early trimester. We have early third trimester. We have bladders distended. We have kidneys hydronephrotic but not echogenic, not too bad looking, liquor just sort of less or dropping down. This is a group of patients where one can potentially think of intervention. So again, what we need to do is do a genetic testing for the fetus, make sure that there are no chromosomal abnormalities, do a repeated puncture of the bladder, make sure the kidneys are functioning well, and if so, again, we can put a shunt from the bladder into the amniotic cavity. So now we have various new shunts which have come up, like Harrison's shunt, which are very easy to introduce, and technically is much easier as compared to the older Dennis shunt. So and again, this, if you have chosen the fetus well, that means the pregnancy well, we can expect a good outcome. So nowadays, of course, what is in vogue is doing a cystoscopic laser ablation of the posterior valve, which of course I have not done, but this is one case which I got from Dr. Suresh, who is very often my mentor when it comes to fetal interventions. I always call him up. So here, for example, we had a fetus with huge bladder, that's the posterior valve, and he is putting a fetus scope, and you can see that that's the posterior urethra, which is quite dilated. So the scope is negotiated up to the posterior urethra, and then the valves are fulgurated with laser. So if you have chosen the fetus at the right time and without the kidneys being dysplastic, this can potentially have a very good outcome and can prevent renal damage in long term. What we are worried about is a renal damage coming up in long term, which can change the prognosis. The other condition where again potentially a lot of interventions are being done world over is valvular stenosis, so typically pulmonary stenosis or aortic stenosis. So for example, whenever there's an aortic stenosis, there are various grades of aortic stenosis. Sometimes you have critical aortic stenosis where the left ventricle dilates, becomes echogenic, fibrinolysis. This may have a bad prognosis. But when you have a moderate to severe stenosis, one can potentially think of an aortic valvuloplasty. So typically there are some criteria, like for example, there should be reversal of flow in the aortic arch, the foramen of will should show reversal of flow, mitral will show a monophasic flow, and then of course we have Z scores for the fetal ventricle and the aorta. And if everything is favorable, then we can potentially again think of doing a fetal valvuloplasty. So this again, I have never done this, but this is one of our patients who was referred to Dr. Nagesh Rao in Hyderabad, and he did this particular procedure. Now, fortunately, in India, we work as a group, and some people could specialize in one particular thing, and it's always good to call them up, and whoever is an expert for the good of the patient, we can refer patients from here to Chennai or Hyderabad, or some people come to Bombay, depending upon the situation. And it's always easy. It's very important that we work as a team whenever in this situation. So that this aortic valve was dilated. That's Dr. Nagesh Rao by him, and this particular fetus has done very well. She came back to us, she delivered in Bombay, and has subsequently done very well. So sometimes simple things like amnio reduction help. For example, this is a pregnancy where we had gross polyhydramnios in the pregnancy, and gross polyhydramnios, and what we saw was typically that the kidneys were mildly dilated, the bladder was persistently full, and the fetus was persistently passing urine. So the fetus is persistently passing urine, there is polyhydramnios, the bladder is persistently distended, so it is not an obstructive uropathy. So when you see this, you should think of a metabolic problem, like for example here we thought of a Barter's syndrome. So we did a gene analysis, confirm it's a Barter's syndrome. And then what we did is we wanted to pull on the pregnancy. So we did a serial amnio reduction, which helped a lot. This particular lady also had lost her first child without any investigations. So unfortunately, we lost this child because of electrolyte imbalance. She was delivered in Jaslow, but there was severe electrolyte imbalance. We did a blood sample, we stored it, we confirmed again. And when she was pregnant next time, we did a CVS at an early stage and it was normal. So it's very important that if you feel that this fetus may not make it because of a problem, the best thing is to take the blood and store it for a DNA, do DNA storage so that you can evaluate the blood later for any disorders. Similarly, one can prolong a pregnancy by amnio infusion, that is putting a needle and then putting up isotonic fluids like normal saline or Ringer lactate. This is not my favorite procedure because very often we could have potential problems like infections, premature delivery. But some people are fond of doing this. If you have oligoamnios, which is idiopathic, one can try and prolong a pregnancy with amnio infusion as well. And then, of course, reductions. So those of you who have been in Bombay know that our trains can get crowded a lot. Nowadays, they're empty because of COVID fear. But similarly, when you have multiple pregnancies like 5, 6 and on, and I'm very happy that Ritu does a single embryo transfer. Here we have 5 pregnancies. We have reduced, the maximum which we have reduced is 7 pregnancies. That means 7 feti, which we reduced to 2. So we reduced 5 pregnancies. So there's no point in continuing such a pregnancy with so many feti. So what we do typically is do embryo reductions. So that's a very simple procedure. We just go into the heart of the fetus, and once you are in the heart, you see some blood coming out. And once you are sure in the heart, you are in the heart, then you just inject some KCL or lignocaine and reduce the baby. It's a very sort of an easy procedure. So typically, we can also do this when we have an abnormality in a twins. Typically, when you have a dichorane pregnancy and one fetus has a fatal abnormality, for example, here one of the fetus has acrania, then the best thing would be to reduce this acranic fetus. So here's another one where we had a dichoronic pregnancy. One has a severe skeletal dysplasia, the other fetus is normal. So what we did is reduce this fetus with skeletal dysplasia with KCL. Of course, he was slightly older, about I think 18 weeks or something. And we did an amnio for the normal well, just to make sure that everything is normal. And rightly so, we continued, and that was the fetus with skeletal dysplasia. That's a newborn girl. Again, this girl is so beautiful. She comes to us every birthday. She is now, I think, 10 years old or a little more than that. And it's a joy to see her. If we had left it alone, she would have suffered because there was a lot of polyhydramnios around this malformed baby, and that would have probably hampered the growth of this particular girl. But when it comes to monochorionic twins, things are different. It's a different chapter, but I'll just touch upon some of the invasive procedures which are again very, very useful to us. So typically in a trap sequence, we know that one fetus is normal, which is known as a pump twin, and one is an cardiac fetus, where very often you have a small heart or no heart, and we have a malformed sort of a soft tissue with a reverse flow in the umbilical artery. Now, if you don't do anything, very often this cardiac twin grows and causes heart failure for the normal fetus, and we want to prevent that. So we have been dealing with this for quite some time. And initially, what we used to do is we used to inject gel foam, because I come from a radiology background, and with this we used to. So that's a gel foam being injected into the cardiac twin. The point is that we should occlude the artery and the vein together, and we used to do it with a relatively large bore needle. And this is the baby born, and that's an cardiac monster there. This child is again done extremely well. So nowadays, of course, what we do is when we have this sort of a situation, we don't do gel foam. What we do is go in with an 18 gauge needle into the cardiac fetus, go near the cord, that's umbilical artery. We know that there would be a reverse flow in the umbilical artery, and then burn it out either with laser or with a radio frequency ablation. And this again has got very good results. And in fact, we will be doing one more next week as well. So this pregnancy again had a very good outcome as well. Then of course, sometimes what happens is you have a dichorionic triamnionic pregnancy with one sac showing two feti, and they want to continue with twins. If you reduce this, then we are left with a monoclonic pair. So if that happens, or you want to reduce a monoclonic pregnancy at an early stage, we can also do a laser ablation. Then, of course, we have TTTS, where you can do cord coagulation with laser, which is a complication of monoclonic twin. This is one such baby which was born after a cord coagulation. Then, of course, when it comes to SFJR or severe for stage 2, 3 coming up at an early stage in a monoclonic twin, then it's worth sacrificing one of the feti so that the other one survives and does well. So typically what we do in this situation is do a bipolar coagulation of the, here in this case, a smaller fetus, so that the other one survived and was born again at 34 weeks of gestation. That's another one where again we did a bipolar quadri. So when you have an SFJR stage 2, 3 coming up at an early stage, typically around 20 weeks of gestation, it's a good idea to sacrifice one so that one of them sees the day of light. That's another one again where we did an RFA. So either we use a radio frequency or we do a bipolar quadri. And that's again a baby which was born healthy. So then of course there are surgeries which we don't do, of course, like meningomyelocele. It was just to complete, and we started off with this saying that when one of the first surgeries for in utero meningomyelocele repair was done, the fetus sort of removed his hand and shook hands with the surgeon. But what is very important is a teamwork, and it's very important to work in a team. And I'm very fortunate to have an excellent team of pediatric cardiologists, pediatric surgeons, neonatologists at Jasnok as well as in Thane. And depending upon the situation, we call in an pediatric orthopedic surgeon. We call it neurosurgeon, pediatric neurosurgeon, depending upon the situation. And we have a counseling sort of a setup. We have 2 geneticists who come. And without this, it is not possible. It's a, at the end of it, when you give good results, it's a fantastic feeling which you can get. So, but remember that the fetus has its own rights, and this is some of the decisions are not very easy. They could have a lot of social implications. They could have a lot of implications in future. It is possible that when the baby grows up, say becomes 18 years old, you might suddenly sue you in the court saying that you did something when I was in fetal. Why did you do this? You never know what will happen. So you don't know in which direction things are going as well. But what I mean is that decision making in such situations may not always be easy, and you have to be very, very careful. But the good thing is that our babies are very, very intelligent, and our mothers normally they see cricket on television. So some of our babies have started seeing cricket. So here, for example, one of our babies, the mother used to see cricket, and before the umpire could raise the hand, the baby also, fetus also used to raise the hand. That was, of course, on a very, very lighter mode. So the thing is that feti are very intelligent. You won't be very surprised that tomorrow when you do a scan, you might see a fetus with a mobile phone or with an iPad inside, because that's what they do after birth. I mean, I see children who come to our center for ultrasound, 3 months, 6 months, to make them quiet. Their parents give them iPads and all. They play with the iPad left, right. Even we don't know some of the functions, but the babies know. And maybe time will come when feti will also be playing with iPads in utero. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure talking to all of you this afternoon. Questions? I'm most happy to.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Chaubal. That was extremely exhaustive and informative and interesting. I think you held everybody spellbound with your photographs and videos.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a few questions, and I think I will start the first one with Dr. Ritu and then come back to you, if that is okay.
Yeah, sure.
So Ritu, you talked about antenatal immunization, RH immunization. Please tell us if there are any studies on single versus double antenatal RH immunoglobulin shots, and whether in a multiple pregnancy or in a twin pregnancy, you need a higher dose or not.
There are various guidelines, madam, for the single also and for the double also. But the studies, there have been no much of a benefit of the double dosing being given over the single dosage. And the second is maybe the patient doesn't come for the follow-up for the second and we may miss it. So I think it's better to prefer the single dosage to be given.
And what gestation?
And it should be at 28 weeks. The dose should be given.
Okay.
And the second question was regarding the twins, madam. So it be a single or a twin, the dose of anti-D remains the same unless we have an issue that there was certain incidence of a heavy fetal maternal hemorrhage, and that we'll have to calculate and then increase the dose.
Because we don't routinely do the Kleihauer-Betke
Yes.
to calculate. And I think that is one of the things that maybe we should implement more routinely to be able to cover all fetal-maternal hemorrhage.
Ma'am, when we are talking about single and double, I have a question. Like suppose if you are giving anti-D at 28 weeks and patient has a bleed after that, then what is the protocol?
Yeah. So if the patient, you've given an anti-D and she has a bleed, we do not need to, I think we need to give an interval of at least 3 weeks before we give the next anti-D to her if she's had a bleed. And because the effect of the anti-D still lasts longer, I think Mala ma'am will also be able to guide us on this, that it lasts as long as 12 weeks. So I think we don't need to repeat it before 3 weeks.
I think you'd be safer doing a Kleihauer-Betke at that time and then deciding, because it will be very variable. Just taking because suppose she's had a lot of bleeding, then obviously your concern is very valid.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yes.
Considering that the number of RH ICU-immunized women is decreasing, there are concerns about the overuse of anti-D, especially in patients with threatened abortions. Now, there is a dispute, or there is a disagreement on whether threatened abortions could require an anti-D, especially early ones. So could you tell us what you think should be done?
Basically, there are two different guidelines which say, one says, yes, you can give, but the other one says, the RCG says, only if there are contractions, only then you would be giving an anti-D. But I find if the risks are more, you find the benefits are more, then I think you should give a dose rather than leaving the patient as it is.
Right.
And there's one question in the chat box, ma'am. They are asking even for the subchorionic hemorrhage. I mean, if it's not a revealed bleeding or in.
I think for subchorionic hematoma, we do not need to give an anti-D. And I would like Mala ma'am also to comment on the same. And unless she's had some bleed.
I think it's a gray area again. I don't know for sure whether you should say that we don't need to give it or we need to give it. I think in all such situations, it is very easy to do a Kleihauer and then decide. I think that may be my solution to this. I mean, I'm more liberal with the use of anti-D, and Priyanka, I would be erring more on the side of covering it rather than leaving it, because our generation has seen a lot of these affected immunized pregnancies. And once immunized, you really can't go back. And we've had really terrible cases. So I would rather be more liberal with the use of anti-D than conservative.
Ritu, can I ask you something?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So what is the current status for CVA recommendations post CVS and post amnio? And in amnio, if the placenta is anterior and the placenta is posterior, and we have not gone through the placenta, what is the current sort of recommendation?
So for all the interventional procedures, CVO or amniocentesis, we need to give the dose for the
even if the placenta is posterior.
Yes.
And you have, yeah.
Even if it is posterior. So I had a question for you, Nitin, and
Yeah, sure.
of course, we need to congratulate our fraternity for the recent decision of the Rajya Sabha passing the bill for deferring the termination gestation to 24 weeks. That was extremely important because most major targeted scan anomalies require termination after 20 weeks, and that was a catch-22 situation. But a lot of issues are with non-lethal malformations, and I'm sure you come across a lot of patients who have like cleft lip, cleft palate, or some such anomaly which is very easily corrected post-birth. And parents are so scared first time around that they will ask for termination. So how do you counsel them, and what are your guidelines?
So that's a very important thing. I think it's a so that's why basically we have a counseling group, and we have experienced pediatric surgeons with us. And as I said, depending upon the situation, we call in other people also. For example, yesterday we have had a fetus with bilateral cleft lip and a median cleft palate complete. So it all depends on the degree. So here we said that it is very severe. So what I'm going to do tomorrow, in fact, is put in a Zoom meeting with a plastic surgeon in Bombay who's an experienced person in this, a genetist, myself, and Jyoti. We'll all sit together and counsel them. So counseling is very important. So I mean, there's no doubt, and what you said is correct, that very often they are misguided. Their conceptions are different. They're misguided, and a good counseling can divert to the way how you put your things can actually make them change the decision. I mean, just one example. When we started counseling, that time, because I come from a radiology background, like we used to see encephaloceles, like cervical encephaloceles, and with bad prognosis and all, children suffering. So we had a meningocele, which was just meninges in the occipital region. So my idea about that anomaly at that time, this is not going to do it. There were no intracranial changes. So the person who started our counseling is one Dr. Sanjay Oak. He's a very famous pediatric surgeon. He put his foot down and said, no, if you want, you can continue. I can assure you that this can be easily corrected and the child will be normal. So I was also taken aback because, each one has his knowledge of his own field, and rightly so, this child was born, there was a small thing which was corrected, and the child is fine. So I think it's very important to, share, have a group and then give a proper counseling. That's the most important thing.
So also with small neural tube defects, lower down.
Lower down, sacral region. We had one more patient 2 days back, whom again we're going to sit with the neurosurgeon. Just sacral, just a meningocele, everything fine. That's it. Ultimately, the call is up to the patient, but then we have to guide them in the right way.
Yeah, because they read up, Google the symptom, meningocele, and they get the worst picture in front of their minds. And that sometimes it is very difficult. I've had situations like this where, or a small VSD, ASD diagnosed at 20 weeks, and they will pester you to terminate, and you feel this is not justified.
Nitin, so first of all, excellent deliberation.
Thank you.
One question, like we're doing an intrauterine transfusion, then how early should we monitor that patient for the MCA, sir?
So normally what we do is after we do that immediately, or maybe, usually she would be admitted somewhere close by. So we just courtesy have a look on the second day, move for the ductus venosus. So typically what we do is, depending upon where they stay, like in our center, they come sometimes from faraway places. Then I might ask one of my students, okay, you look at an MCA Doppler after 2 or 3 weeks. Typically, we give them 3 weeks. It depends upon how severe it was at that time also, at what gestational age.
So then after this IUT, are we worried of any neonatal complications also, sir?
Touch wood, I mean, we have not seen much of neonatal complications. No.
What about the blood group of the baby? After you have done IUTs, does the blood group of the baby change after birth?
No, it doesn't change. It doesn't change. It won't change. But what you have corrected is a fetal anemia. I mean, anemia which could have overloaded the fetal heart and, basically give us to cardiac failure. And again, when you see something at term, near term, like 36 weeks and all, and there's severe anemia, there's a tendency for the pediatrician to say, okay, you deliver, I'll take care postnatally. But it is a much better thing to do an in vitro correction and then deliver. These babies do better, much better.
Then is there any time that should pass before she delivers? Is it?
After the transfusion?
After the intrauterine transfusion.
No, I don't think there's a specific time, but we once the anemia is corrected, we would wait comfortably till steroids are given and lung maturity is good. That should be fine.
Right.
We have a neonatologist also in our one of the chairpersons, Dr. Supriya. So I have a question for her. Somebody has asked, what are the diagnostic tests in RH incompatibility that we do in a newborn after birth?
First of all, I would like to say thanks to Dr. Ritu ma'am and Dr. Nitin sir for the wonderful and really exhausting and wonderful summarization of the presentation, especially Dr. Nitin sir. So the way that you summarized majority of the antenatal conditions and the brief treatment as well, it is really wonderful. And the talk after your talk, it will make most of us to think that okay, things are possible now more and more because the people like you are there, so we can save more and more babies. And once you do your job, my job is the job of persons like me. हमारा job कम हो जाता है, so we have less tension afterwards. But yes, so now let me come to the question that what are the diagnostic tests, I suppose. So once we already know that the RH incompatibility is there, like mother is RH negative and father is RH positive, and after the baby is born, so basic tests are being done is initially, first of all, the baby blood group and the CBC, and what is the blood picture, if it is showing peripheral hemolysis in the peripheral blood smear, what is the direct womb test saying, and what is the jaundice level. So accordingly, if we know what are the tests, then we can accordingly plan how to manage the baby.
Nitin sir, one more thing, you talked about tachyarrhythmia. So what about the bradycardias? Because once we got a patient with persistent bradycardia, I mean, we followed her up.
So depending upon the type of bradycardia, some of them do very well with steroids as well as salbutamol or beta blockers. But it all depends upon the type of, typically if you have a sinus bradycardia, then they could do well with a bit of, and of course the cause. I mean, most of these bradycardias, the mother has, anti-D, anti-O factors. So if that is so it all depends upon the cause. But sometimes if you have an idiopathic bradycardia, typically a sinus bradycardia, they respond well to steroids and beta blockers as well.
I have a question for Dr. Nitin. We had recently had a patient with pylictasis and a huge bladder with, just like you told from your own experience. How do we prognosticate? And in our setups where sometimes patients cannot afford a lot of treatments, how do we tell them, how do we decide which of these conditions are treatable and need to be referred?
So there is something known as a UTD classification. Okay, so because there are various grades of dilatation of kidneys, various grades of dilatation of ureters, as well as bladder, whether kidney pelvis is dilated or calluses are dilated. So there is something known as UTD classification, which you can easily find out net. And once you put them in that, then you can find out how much is the risk in that particular fetus. So if it's a low risk, like as I said, if the liquor is good, there's mild dilatation, calluses are not dilated, parenchyma looking good, you can reassure them that, okay, prognosis is going to be good. Suppose you have picked up something which is very early and you have kidneys which are already showing dysplastic changes, there's no point actually. Once the kidneys are dysplastic, once there is severe oligoamnios, there's going to be lung hypoplasia, and we are going to land up with a lot of problems. So, so this grading basically helps us in differentiating where we fall into. Now, the group of feti who can potentially be treated actually would narrow down to a very small range. In practice, it is usually those which we see early with bad things, or sometimes we see them in late trimester who have a good outcome. The actual ones, where potentially we can intervene, actually in practice would be a very, very narrow range. So, but you have to identify them at the right thing, and that can be done with this classification system.
Thank you. I would like to thank everyone. Thank you, Ritu ma'am, and thank you, Dr. Nitin, for wonderful talks and giving us time to our society.
So it's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Priyanka, Dr. Mala ma'am. Thank you so much. Dr. Priyanka, Dr. Supriya, Dr. Anjali, and Dr. Sangeeta.
Thanks, and it is really nice to be here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for allowing us to share platform, allowing me to share this platform. And sir has brought a lot of personal experience. I think he's told us what is not preventable is salvageable or at least manageable. So, and ma'am was so lucid and she walked us in detail. So I think it was a wonderful experience for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chanchal. Thank you, Dr. Kiran Channa.
Mala ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Sunita. And last but not the least, obviously, we thank Jackson Pal for organizing all the technical work in this webinar.
Ma'am, Jackson Pal would like to thank all. Jackson Pal brings to you injection maintain 500 and 250 mg, hydroxyprogesterone caproate, Lycorid preg sachet of L-arginine, DHA, and lycopene to avoid pregnancy complications. And we also have progesterone sustained release tablets as Divagest SR 200 and 300. My teammates, Dr. Vipin Tyagi and Mr. Amit Saxena join me, Dr. Deepika, to thank all the esteemed faculty present with us today. We hope to go a long way in knowledge sharing with the unending support of all the attendees. We hope to see you again in our next webinar, which is this Sunday, organized by South Zone Yuva Foxy. We are hosting their zonal quiz, which will be virtual, and there will be special interaction for the attendees to win cash prizes through Zoom and Kahoot app. Kahoot app needs to be downloaded before joining. So do join us 21st March, 12 noon onwards. Thank you very much.